legendary actress, singer, songwriter, and entrepreneur Dolly Parton has passed away at the age of 80. Her achievements reaching far beyond her humble country roots.
There was something wrong inside Dolly Parton's body long before the world understood how serious it had become. For months, she smiled through interviews and waved through car windows while doctors quietly ran tests she never spoke about publicly. On the 25th of August, 2026, that silence finally broke, and the world learned she had been fighting something in the dark, completely alone, hiding a fear she never let anyone see. The announcement that broke Nashville. On the 25th of August, 2026, in the early afternoon, a video appeared on Dolly Parton's official page that fans had been dreading for almost a year without ever saying it out loud to each other. The man speaking was Brian Seaver, her nephew and her longtime head of security, a role his own father Larry had held before him for decades. He said he was speaking for the entire Parton and Owens family, and then he said the words that stopped millions of people wherever they were standing that afternoon. Dolly Rebecca Parton. Dean had died.
And I'm representing the Parton and Owens family today, announcing the passing of my Aunt Dolly Rebecca Parton Dean. This video announcement is something Dolly asked of me years ago before I fully absorbed it as a future reality.
If you have ever gotten a phone call like that, the kind that arrives on an ordinary afternoon and quietly changes the shape of the whole day, you already know the strange stillness that follows. That stillness settled over Nashville within minutes and spread outward from there. Seaver explained that Dolly had personally asked him years earlier to be the one who delivered this news whenever the day came. He said he had imagined the weight of that moment for years and had never truly felt it until he was standing there saying the words out loud. Then he said something that told fans exactly the kind of woman she had remained until her final breath. Sadness lies with us, not with Dolly. In that same message, Seaver shared one more request Dolly had made herself, and it said more about her than any award ever could. She wanted to be laid to rest, wrapped in something soft, a bed of plush cotton, because after 8 decades spent dazzling the world in heavy rhinestones, she felt she had finally earned the right to be comfortable. Her family's official statement offered one more piece of the story, and it was not the piece anyone had expected. Dolly had died at the Vanderbilt Ingram Cancer Center in Nashville, following what her representatives called a brief battle with cancer. They never named the type. They never said how long she had actually known. For a woman who had spent 60 years letting cameras into nearly every corner of her life, that silence felt deliberate, and it left an entire fan base quietly wondering how much of this she had chosen to carry by herself. 4 days before that message reached the public, inside a hospital room nobody outside her closest family ever saw, doctors had already told the people who loved her most what was coming, and Dolly spent those final days doing exactly what she had done for her entire 80 years, protecting everyone around her from a truth she was not ready to let them carry. The battle she hid from the world. 4 days before Brian Seaver posted that message, Dolly was admitted to Vanderbilt University Medical Center in Nashville with kidney and autoimmune complications her body could no longer manage on its own. It was a Friday, and by every account, nobody outside her innermost circle understood how serious that admission truly was. That same week, in what became her final interview, she spoke to a reporter from People magazine and gave fans one honest sentence that now reads like a confession. She admitted she had been dealing with health issues she simply did not pay attention to while she was caring for her husband. Her decline had actually been building for well over a year before that final interview, even if most fans only pieced it together afterwards. In the spring, she posted a video revealing she was struggling with kidney stones again, joking that doctors were pulling more stones out of her than a quarry could produce in a year. She admitted her immune system and her digestive system had been, in her own words, out of whack for a few years running. In June, she made a rare public appearance at the opening of a small travel stop bearing her name, and fans who saw the footage were startled by how frail and unsteady she looked, walking the short distance to the podium. People close to her reportedly began quietly limiting her public appearances after that day. By the middle of August, the toll had become impossible to hide completely. She was scheduled to appear in person at the opening of a new ride at her own theme park, and instead, she recorded a message from home, explaining that dizziness and dehydration had become a regular part of her life. She told fans her doctor had, in her own words, clipped her wings for the week. It made people laugh at the time. Looking back at it now, it lands very differently. She had spent 60 years being one of the most open public figures in American entertainment, willing to joke about her body, her surgeries, and even her own mortality on camera. Yet, in the one health battle that would actually end her life, she chose almost total privacy, never publicly naming the disease that was killing her until it was already too late to matter. Nearly everyone who worked closely with her during that final year points to the exact same turning point behind her decline. And it happened a year and a half earlier, in the third month of 2025, when the one person she never had to perform for stopped coming home. The man who never wanted the spotlight. Carl Dean died on the 3rd of March, 2025, at the age of 82, closing out a marriage that had lasted nearly 59 years.
Dolly Parton managed to keep her longtime marriage with Carl Dean out. On Monday, the country artist announced on Instagram that her beloved husband of nearly 60 years had passed away at the age of 82.
For most of those years, the public barely knew what he looked like, and that was entirely by his own design. They met on the very first day Dolly arrived in Nashville, standing outside the wishy-washy laundromat when she was just 18 years old, with a cardboard suitcase and a guitar. She once described that moment with a kind of quiet wonder, saying he looked at her face, which she called a rare thing for her at the time. 2 days later, they had their first date. They married on the 30th of May, 1966, in a small ceremony with no cameras and no industry guests. And from that day forward, Carl kept a promise he never once broke. He gave exactly one interview in his entire life. He ran his own asphalt paving business, stayed out of every spotlight she ever stood in, and simply waited for her at home each time she came back from the road. In 1982, someone asked her what that marriage meant to her, and her answer has stayed with fans ever since. She said she would love to grow old with him, and that her love for him ran that deep. She got exactly that, 59 years of growing old together, almost entirely out of public view. When Carl died, something in Dolly changed in a way close friends noticed almost immediately, even though the public took months to catch on. She grew quieter. She traveled less. Anyone who has watched a parent or a partner fade after losing the person they loved most knows that grief does not always look like crying in public. 2 weeks after his death, the Grand Ole Opry held a major anniversary celebration, and Dolly was too fragile to attend in person. Reba McEntire, Carrie Underwood, and Lady A stood on that stage instead and sang "I Will Always Love You" in her honor, while she sent a video message thanking everyone for keeping her in their thoughts. By that October, fans had grown worried enough that her sister Frida posted publicly asking people to pray for Dolly. Dolly's own reply became one of the most quoted lines of her final year. She simply wrote that she was not dead yet, delivered with the exact same humor people had loved about her for 6 decades. She and Carl never had children of their own, something Dolly discussed publicly many times over the years without ever reducing it to one simple reason. What she built instead, in the decades that followed, was a different kind of family entirely. One made up of millions of children around the world who grew up knowing her not as a country singer, but as the woman who mailed them a book every single month. That instinct to keep smiling and keep giving no matter what she carried inside did not begin with losing Carl. It began nearly 60 years earlier, in a one-room cabin with no walls thick enough to keep out the Tennessee winter. A cabin with no walls to keep out the cold. Dolly Rebecca Parton was born on the 19th of January, 1946, in Locust Ridge, Tennessee, the fourth of 12 children crowded into a single-room cabin in the foothills of the Great Smoky Mountains. There was no electricity. There was no running water. In the winter, the cold came straight through the walls, as though the walls were barely there at all. Her father, Robert Lee Parton, could not read or write, and the family had so little money that he paid the doctor who delivered her with a sack of cornmeal instead of cash. That single detail explains so much about who she became. She grew up wearing dresses her mother sewed from old flour sacks. She grew up going to school in shoes that rarely fit quite right. The coat she wore one particular winter, stitched together from scraps of fabric by her mother's hands, would later become the inspiration for one of the most personal songs she ever wrote. By the age of 8, she was performing on a local radio station in Knoxville. By 10, she had a regular spot on a regional television program called the Cass Walker Farm and Home Hour, standing in front of a camera in a flour sack dress and singing as though she had been doing it her whole life, which in a way she had. She recorded her first single called Puppy Love at just 13 years old. It did not make her famous, but it convinced the people who heard it that something rare was happening in that girl from the mountains. The day after she graduated high school in 1964, she did not wait around to celebrate. She packed what little she owned and boarded a bus to Nashville completely alone, 18 years old, carrying nothing but a cardboard suitcase, a guitar, and a level of certainty that must have looked reckless to everyone who watched her leave. Years later, once she had the resources to do something about the childhood she came from, she thought constantly about her father, sitting in that same cabin, unable to read the letters she sent him, unable to read a bedtime story to his own children. The same fearlessness that put her on a bus to Nashville with nothing but a guitar would also put her directly in the path of a powerful man who could make her a star, a man who would spend years trying to make sure she never had the chance to leave him. The man who tried to own her voice. In 1967, 3 years after arriving in Nashville with nothing, Dolly joined the Porter Wagoner Show, a program broadcast to more than 100 stations across the country. Porter Wagoner was one of the biggest names in country music at the time, and by most accounts he was a complicated man, generous toward the people he mentored, but also fiercely controlling of the career he had helped launch. Her first #1 single, called Joshua, arrived in 1971, and it confirmed exactly what Wagoner had suspected the moment he first heard her sing. 2 years later, in 1973, she wrote 2 songs in a single stretch that would go on to define the rest of her career. Jolene came together in one recording session, built around a raw and desperate plea from one woman to another that artists on every continent still cover today. The second song, I Will Always Love You, was not written as a love song at all. It was written as a goodbye, a way of telling Porter Wagoner that she was leaving his show to build a solo career of her own. Before she released it, she played it for him in person. He reportedly cried when he heard it, and even as he tried everything he could to convince her to stay, he understood exactly what that song meant. She left anyway, and it cost her. Wagoner sued her for $3 million, claiming breach of contract. And rather than fight it out publicly, she settled the case and moved forward without letting the bitterness slow her down. There were too many songs left to write, and she meant that quite literally. People who worked with her during that period often described her finishing 2 or 3 songs in a single day, treating that kind of output as completely ordinary. Almost 2 decades later, in 1992, Whitney Houston recorded I Will Always Love You for the film The Bodyguard, and it became one of the best-selling singles in the history of popular music. Because Dolly had kept the publishing rights to that song when she wrote it, as a young woman fighting for her independence, those royalties poured back to her for years afterwards. She later said, with the kind of quiet satisfaction only she could pull off, that those very royalties helped pay for Dollywood. Winning her independence from Porter Wagoner taught her something about protecting what belonged to her that she carried into nearly every decision for the rest of her life, including several the public completely mistook for simple generosity. The empire built on a broken heart. In 1995, back in the same county where she grew up with nothing, Dolly founded the Imagination Library as a direct tribute to her father and his inability to read. What started as a small local program mailing books to children in Sevier County grew, over the following decades, into a global operation that had sent more than 300 million free books to children across 5 countries by the time she died. She funded much of it herself in the early years, long before it attracted outside support, and she never once treated it as a publicity exercise. She called it, more than once, the accomplishment she was proudest of, ahead of every Grammy and every chart position she ever earned. Her career, meanwhile, kept expanding into places nobody expected a country singer from the mountains to go. In 1980, she recorded the title track for the film 9 to 5 between takes on set, reportedly tapping out the rhythm with her acrylic nails because there was no drum machine available. That song earned her an Academy Award nomination. Across her career, she went on to win 11 Grammy Awards, a number that places her among the most decorated artists in American music history. What surprised a lot of people, especially given how beloved she was across the political spectrum, was how many honors she quietly turned down. The Trump administration offered her the Presidential Medal of Freedom, not once but twice, and both times she declined, first because Carl was ill, and later because she refused to travel during the pandemic. When Barack Obama later admitted on television that failing to award her that same medal during his own presidency had been, in his words, a screw-up, Dolly was asked whether she might accept it from Joe Biden instead. She said she was not sure, explaining that taking it at that point might look political, and staying out of politics was something she had spent her entire career carefully protecting. In 2022, she was nominated for the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, and initially turned that down as well, saying publicly that she did not feel she had earned that particular right. The Hall convinced her otherwise. She accepted the induction, and, true to her word, she spent the next year building an entire rock album from scratch. Rockstar arrived in November of 2023 when she was 77 years old. A 30-track record featuring Paul McCartney, Ringo Starr, Stevie Nicks, and her own goddaughter Miley Cyrus among its collaborators.
They recently got Ringo Starr, Paul McCartney, Sting, Elton John, Stevie Nicks. The list goes on and on their new rock album. And that artist is none other than icon Dolly Parton.
Behind all of it, quietly and away from cameras, she had also personally helped fund early research connected to a vaccine used around the world, a fact she rarely brought up herself. None of that empire, none of those carefully managed decisions about her own image would be enough to stop what was already growing quietly inside her body during what turned out to be the final summer of her life. In the hours after her death was confirmed, Dolly's family made one thing clear immediately. There would be no large public funeral, no grand memorial broadcast to the world. At her own explicit request, only a small private service would be held for immediate family. In place of flowers, they asked people to send donations to the Imagination Library instead, a request that felt entirely in character for a woman who spent her whole life turning attention toward other people rather than herself. She will be buried beside Carl, closing the distance between them one final time. If Dolly Parton's music, her books, or her story ever found you at the right moment in your life, tell us about it in the comments below. We would love to know which song you are playing tonight in her memory.